In other news, on Friday, scores of supporters just outside the Bloemfontein Magistrate's court, where the ANC Secretary General Ace Magashule appeared on charges relating to the failed 255 million rand asbestos eradication tender back in 2014 in the Free State province. Now, some of his supporters included senior ANC members such as Tony Ngeni Bulemabe, Supermahumo Bello, and Mzwandile Masina. While there is speculation on whether there's general support for him in the party at large, it raises questions about factions within the ANC. Now, what does this say about support for the Secretary General by the majority of the ANC members? Joining us to unpack this is political analyst Lukhona Mnguni. A very good morning to you, Lukhona. Thank you very much for joining us here on Weekend Dawn. I mean, ultimately, we're looking at the reforms that President Cyril Ramaphosa is currently trying to take at large and how it's been impacted by its internal opponents. I mean, walk us through how these factions are currently outplaying and how it's, impacting the political landscape as we speak.
Well, good morning, Liezle, and good morning to your viewers. Certainly, when the ANC left Nasrec conference, one of the things I kept talking a lot about was that the reconfiguration of power within the ANC was in such a messy manner because of that conference outcome, where both factions that were gunning for power actually ended up with two very important positions, the position of the president and the position of Secretary General. And it was the first time, probably at least as far as we can track back to 1991, that immediately after a conference, the president and the Secretary General literally do not sing from the same hymn book, and they are contesting each other from the get-go. If you remember, soon after that conference, Ace Magashule went to KwaZulu-Natal, and he really reassured his supporters there that it would be only a matter of 5 years until that they work for an outcome that everybody would be happy with and that everybody in their faction would have a share in. Now then they tried to have a moment of preaching unity and renewal of the ANC, but on the background of all of that preaching of unity and renewal were fierce contestations. Now, one of the biggest things is people do not want to be held accountable for things that they may have done in the past when they were in government. We know, for example, that Magashule is no longer in government. And the problem with that, when you have a center of authority that is meant to marshal the entire organization towards some moralistic behavior, towards some ethical behavior, and yet the very person who is at Luthuli House managing that engine room is so compromised, as we have seen with Ace Magashule, it paralyzes the entire organization, because to an extent, you then create narratives of conspiracy making. We've seen, for example, the mayor of Ekurhuleni, Mzwandile Masina, marshalling all black people to come together and ban the leaders because this corruption is targeting black people, which is not entirely true. But also, even if that were the case, it does not absent the fact that people must answer for the wrongs that they have done. So now you've got a problem in the ANC where there is no consensus on how to deal with wrongdoing, on how to deal with questions of malfeasance, on how to deal with leaders that have strayed outside of the objectives and the mission of the organization. And because of that consensus, what we are starting to see is that in actual fact in the ANC there's no longer a center, because the very body, which is the highest decision-making body in between conferences, the National Executive Committee, is the most contested body, and it finds it difficult to actually take decisions. And one would think that is why even President Ramaphosa opted, for example, when he wanted to write that 7-page letter on corruption, he opted to write that letter ahead of an NEC meeting rather than write it after an NEC meeting as a mandate of the NEC meeting. So he sort of preempted discussions in the NEC, which was a good strategy for him, because he actually realizes that it's very difficult to get any faction for reform or for a political reform agenda within the ANC. Where he is most likely to do a great reform agenda is in the state, using that power, ensuring that law enforcement agencies have the necessary independence to act without fear or favor, and to go after anybody that they go without political hindrance on their way that is imposed, particularly from the office of the president. So that's the best thing he can do in terms of a reform agenda. But in terms of the politics, I do not think that the power has even tilted enough internally within the ANC for there to be some level of consensus that leaders who put to shame the name of the organization by being implicated so severely on some of these corruption cases, they should step aside or should step down, as you know, they always entangle themselves in those terms.
Lukhona, I just want to pick up on what you were saying about the narratives and the lack of consensus and unity that is coming through, you know, as the party enters local government elections as well as a national conference in 2022 for 2024 elections. But when we ultimately look at some of the top members who claim that they are in fact also being sidelined by the party at large, I mean the likes of Supra Mahumapelo amongst others, ultimately, I mean, what does this further indicate about the factions within the party? And then going forward, when we look at what this case represents for the party, for President Cyril Ramaphosa and his camp at large, for the NPA, the Hawks, etc., I mean, what impact is this also likely to reflect in those dynamics?
Well, look, I think for the NPA and the Hawks, the threat is always being painted with a political agenda. So the Hawks and the NPA, the more they seem to be arresting and processing and prosecuting persons who belong or are suspected to belong to the same faction, the more those outside the processes who will politic and say that the Hawks and the NPA are being used. Of course, people will want to see that, you know, this work is done earnestly and across all factions, because there are allegations across all factions. So you are looking at the questions of PPEs, how long will it take? But then the point of caution is also that, you know, there is a serious backlog in the system because the Hawks and the NPA have acted with such inefficiency for a long time. So there's a lot of backlog in the system. Therefore, the current arrests and, you know, processing and prosecutions that we see are partly just a function of that backlog, and not necessarily a function of political targeting. There will always be, in any environment, this suspicion of political targeting, and it is the duty of those law enforcement agencies to make sure that they rise above that and demonstrate that they do not have anything to do with political sides. But I think on the political side inside the ANC, what we might end up with, which is actually a very unfortunate and unintended consequence of the whole cleanup process and fight against corruption, is that you might end up with more people accused of corruption in certain leadership echelons of the organization, and that will galvanize people around a common interest of staying out of jail if possible, and of retaining or regaining power so that they may be able to then try and influence some of these law enforcement agencies. So you might see a reconfiguration of power to gravitate towards the more side of people who are actually alleged to have committed some form of wrongdoing because they have a common interest to protect each other. And as you know, sometimes the good guys, they are often timid, they are often weak in terms of their aspirations, and they tend to lack the courage of their convictions. And that is what we are going to be looking out for here. How well are the good guys going to push back? Because if you remember very well, Joel Netshitenzhe, probably about 2 or 3 years ago now, made a very interesting talk and said the people who have benefited from malfeasance will definitely fight back. And they will not go down without a fight. The question is whether or not those who are perceived as good leaders are going to fight back. Because if you look at people like Supra Mahumapelo, for example, there is a sense that they want to be part of a permanent arrangement of leadership, for example, in the Northwest. Yes, how he was removed was challenged in court, and the court agreed with Supra Mahumapelo, and therefore you can't dispense with him so easily. But then it also tells us that leaders of the ANC no longer have capacity to introspect and then determine whether they are still fit for purpose to lead in the ANC and whether they would go through that proverbial eye of the needle.
Well, Lukhona, it'll be interesting to see how the testing of the legal processes also, unfold as this case, as we continue to monitor the case, and also just the history of prosecution at large, also the various tactics that are being employed, and when the final outcome ultimately will be emerged. Again, thank you very much, Lukhona Mnguni, for your time here on Weekend Dawn Newsroom Africa. Political analyst Lukhona Mnguni just chatting to us about the latest regarding the Ace Magashule saga.